And a lot of stuff that I say to y'all all the time, I know y'all take it like, yo, that was hardcore. That is the game you in. I am sorry, that is the game you decided to get in. I like fucking them up. You have to know that.
The courtroom fell into a breathless, stunned silence on day 15 of what has become the most explosive celebrity trial in recent memory. Ryan Reynolds, the beloved actor, global icon, and embodiment of Hollywood charm, strode into courtroom 26B on the 23rd floor of Manhattan's Daniel Patrick Moynihan Courthouse. Gone was the smirking, quick-witted persona fans adored on screen. In its place stood a man burdened by secrets too strange, too disturbing to be fiction. Dressed in a crisp charcoal suit, his expression was grave, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. As he passed rows of journalists, shell-shocked spectators, and a gallery lined with hushed celebrities, murmurs erupted like a spark in dry brush. At the defense table, Sean "Diddy" Combs sat motionless, his usual swagger drained. When Reynolds' gaze met his, a flicker of something primal crossed Diddy's face. Fear, maybe rage, maybe recognition. Judge Arun Subramanian, commanding a room already electric with anticipation, struck the gavel. "Order," he said, his voice sharp. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams stood beside prosecutors Emily Johnson and Maureen Comey. "Your Honor," Williams said, "Mr. Reynolds is ready to testify." What followed would unravel Hollywood mythology and crack open a world the public never imagined. Reynolds took the stand and adjusted the microphone with trembling fingers. Though his voice was steady, his eyes bore the weight of something unspoken, something rotten beneath the surface of stardom. The courtroom sat frozen, transfixed. Even the usual rustle of papers and clicking of pens had ceased. When he finally spoke, it was with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man replaying a nightmare. "It was always after midnight," Reynolds began, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the courtroom. "That was the rule. No one arrived before 12:01. The gates would open and we were ushered in, phones confiscated, identities left at the door." U.S. Attorney Damian Williams, seated beside Emily Johnson and Maureen Comey, nodded gravely. "Please describe what happened next," Williams prompted gently. Reynolds' throat tightened. There were candles in every room, thick incense, a kind of humming, low, rhythmic chanting from hidden speakers or maybe people already inside I never knew. We were led down to a tiled chamber beneath the mansion. That's where the baths were. He paused. Not water, tomato soup, steaming hot. Not a metaphor, literal soup. You'd step in, strip down, and wait for your name to be called. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Judge Arun Subramanian rapped the gavel once, eyes scanning the stunned faces. Let him finish. Groups of naked celebrities? Reynolds continued, all praying in a circle. Some cried, others laughed. It was like a trance. At the center, Diddy would appear in red robes holding something, an old book, sometimes a ladle. I thought it was performance art at first, theater, weird celebrity bonding. But then it got darker. He took a shaky breath. He whispered to me while I was neck deep in soup, said I needed to let go of my ego. That fame was a spirit, and to keep it, I had to serve it, serve him. That's when I realized it wasn't just a ritual, it was indoctrination. A beat passed. Thick with disbelief. One juror covered her mouth. A man in the gallery shook his head in disbelief. He convinced us that our careers, our families, even our lives depended on this, Reynolds added, his voice growing hoarse. He called it soul unlocking. I call it psychological warfare. The myth of celebrity was crumbling, soup-stained, candle-lit, and deeply unsettling. The air in courtroom 26B thickened like fog, charged with disbelief and something darker, dread. Even the clatter of courtroom sketch artists had ceased. Everyone leaned in as Ryan Reynolds' voice dropped to a near whisper, recounting a night that, until now, had lived only in the shadows of his memory. It was the third or fourth time, Reynolds said, eyes glassy, looking past the jury as if staring into another realm. They told me this night was special. Consecrated, I think someone called it. The temperature in the chamber was unbearable. The soup was nearly boiling. His words hung in the air, unreal but spoken with such conviction, no one dared dismiss them. I was submerged up to my neck, he continued. Steam everywhere, I couldn't see the others, but I could hear the chanting, low, repetitive, and then I felt someone kneel beside the tub. It was Diddy. The gallery collectively held its breath. One reporter dropped his pen. He leaned in so close I could feel his breath, Reynolds said. He whispered in my ear, said this would unlock the soul. That if I ever wanted to truly belong, not just in Hollywood, but in eternity, I had to surrender. Fame, the applause, the immortality of image, he said none of it was mine to keep unless I gave myself over, completely. Audible gasps rippled across the room. One juror blinked rapidly, shaking her head in disbelief. A woman in the second row appeared to stifle a sob. At the defense table, attorneys Mark Agnifilo and Tenny Garagos leaned in toward one another, whispering furiously. Tenny scribbled a note and slid it across the table. Diddy, seated between them, remained still. His hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale, jaw clenched like a bear trap. He didn't speak, but his eyes were locked on Reynolds, unblinking. Judge Arun Subramanian looked momentarily stunned himself before regaining composure. The gallery will remain silent, he ordered, voice sharper than before. This is a court of law. But the truth, or at least Reynolds' truth, was already out. It slithered into the room like smoke through a vent, impossible to ignore. That night, Reynolds said, I stopped being Ryan. I became a piece of something I couldn't name, and I've never been the same since. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. By now, the courtroom was no longer just listening. They were bearing witness. What began as surreal was morphing into something far more sinister. Ryan Reynolds, once stoic and measured, now spoke with unmistakable fury. His polished Hollywood cadence gave way to raw emotion as he peeled back the layers of what he described as a system of psychological domination. He made me believe everything I had. My voice, my family, my life was tied to those rituals, Reynolds said, his tone rising. He didn't just manipulate behavior, he twisted identity. He'd say, they don't love you, Ryan. They love the version I let you keep. The courtroom was silent, gripped by every syllable. He called it spiritual protection. Reynolds continued, his voice darkening. I call it spiritual kidnapping. On the prosecution's bench, Assistant U.S. Attorney Emily Johnson shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening as she fought back a visible wave of emotion. Next to her, Maureen Comey furiously underlined a phrase in her notes. Even Damian Williams, who had remained composed throughout the trial, leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on Reynolds. But at the defense table, Diddy's legal team was quick to respond. Objection, Your Honor, Mark Agnifilo barked, rising abruptly. Character assassination. This is not testimony. It's theatrical conjecture. Judge Arun Subramanian, who had watched the proceedings with a calm but piercing gaze, didn't blink. Overruled, he said coldly. The witness may continue. Diddy, still silent, clenched his fists beneath the table. He glanced toward Reynolds with a look that was neither denial nor remorse. Just quiet, burning defiance. Reynolds turned back to the jury, his voice now trembling with urgency. Every time I tried to walk away, he'd remind me of what I had to lose. He'd say, look around, none of this is real without me. And for a while, I believed him. We all did. He paused and looked out into the gallery, scanning familiar faces, former collaborators, industry figures, and people who had once called him friend. Some looked away, others looked broken. He didn't protect us, Reynolds concluded. He imprisoned us with our own dreams. And just like that, the mask of glamour cracked wider, revealing a chilling game of fame and fear. Tenny Garagos stood slowly, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor as she approached the witness stand. The daughter of courtroom legend Mark Garagos, she carried herself with equal parts elegance and venom. Her eyes, sharp and unreadable, locked onto Ryan Reynolds like a hawk circling wounded prey. Mr. Reynolds, she began, her voice cool but edged with steel. You're an actor, an award-winning one. Isn't it true you are trained, highly trained, to perform? Reynolds didn't flinch. He straightened in his chair, folding his hands calmly. Yes, he replied, and I also know when I'm being played. A few members of the gallery murmured quietly, whether in admiration or disbelief was unclear. Garagos smirked slightly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. So these alleged naked rituals, these tomato soup baths, was anyone held at gunpoint? Were there shackles? Did anyone say the word no and get dragged back in? Reynolds' jaw tensed, but he stayed composed. No, he said, because by then I didn't know what reality was anymore. That's what manipulation does. It doesn't take your body, it takes your mind, your compass. It tells you that fear is normal, that pain is progress. Garagos narrowed her gaze. Did you call the police? A therapist? Anyone? Reynolds paused, looking down briefly. No, he said finally. Because when someone convinces you that your family's safety, your fame, your existence depend on them, you don't pick up the phone. You pray they don't turn on you. The tension in the courtroom turned brittle. Jurors scribbled furiously, pens scratching across notepads with newfound urgency. One juror, an older man in a tweed jacket, blinked rapidly, trying to keep up. At the prosecution table, Damian Williams leaned over to whisper something to Maureen Comey. Emily Johnson kept her eyes locked on Geragos, her expression unreadable. Geragos wasn't done. "So you're saying, Mr. Reynolds, that one of the most powerful, beloved men in Hollywood lost all sense of reality because Sean Combs lit some candles and said strange things in the dark?" Reynolds' voice, now calm but flint-hard, cut through the silence. "I'm saying Sean Combs built a world where reality was his to define, and for a long time, we lived in it." Gasps rose again, and the storm inside Courtroom 26B raged on. The tension in Courtroom 26B had reached a combustible pitch by the time Tenny Geragos concluded her blistering cross-examination. Jurors were visibly rattled, and murmurs from the gallery danced on the edge of contempt. But it was Sean Diddy Combs himself who finally shattered the fragile decorum. As Ryan Reynolds finished recounting a chilling detail, an evening where a fellow actor allegedly collapsed in the soup chamber from heat exhaustion, Diddy shook his head with disgust and muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the room to catch it, "Lies." A sharp, collective gasp swept across the room. Prosecutors froze. The defense table stiffened. Reynolds blinked slowly, the silence punctuating the weight of the word. Then came the thunderclap. Bang! Judge Arun Subramanian slammed his gavel against the hardwood with force. "Mr. Combs," he said, voice booming with authority, "this is a federal courtroom, not a music video, not a rehearsal for bravado, and certainly not a place for commentary." He leaned forward, locking eyes with Diddy in a rare show of judicial emotion. "Another outburst, and I will have you physically removed. Are we clear?" The room was frozen, airless. Diddy, jaw tight and lips pressed into a thin line, offered no response. But the glare he cast toward Reynolds was searing, less defiant than betrayed. He looked not at a rival, but at a man he once considered tethered to his empire. For a moment, the courtroom became a stage of contrasts. The restrained power of the bench, the crumbling silence of celebrity, and the strange intimacy of two men who had shared something the public couldn't fully grasp. Behind Reynolds, a woman in the gallery crossed herself. In the jury box, a young man tapped his pen nervously against his notes, his earlier composure shaken. Judge Subramanian cleared his throat and continued, tone flat but resolute. "Let the record reflect Mr. Combs's interruption. The jury will disregard the comment." He turned to the jury with quiet conviction. "You are here to weigh facts, not personalities. Fame is not a shield. It is not a sword. Proceed, Mr. Williams." As Damian Williams rose for redirect, the weight of the moment was undeniable. This was no longer just a trial. It was an unraveling, and the gavel was the only thing keeping it from collapsing into chaos. By the afternoon of day 15, the trial had long since spilled beyond the boundaries of Courtroom 26B. Outside the courthouse, the sidewalks teemed with protesters, paparazzi, influencers, and curious onlookers, all pressing against metal barricades under the weight of what had become the most bizarre celebrity trial in modern history. Signs bobbed above the crowd, "Let Ryan heal, where there's smoke, there's soup, and expose the circle." Online, the frenzy surged. The hashtag #TomatoSoupGate shot to the top of trending topics on X, Instagram, and TikTok, closely followed by #FreeReynolds and the more cryptic "Unlock the Soul." Memes flooded social media, but many posts struck a darker tone. Threads of other celebrities now being speculated upon, images of Diddy's mansion dissected like crime scenes. Reddit sleuths claim to have found infrared images showing a hot chamber beneath the mansion grounds. Inside the courtroom, the mood was just as electric, but far more somber. The gallery had filled with a parade of high-profile names, actors, executives, even a few producers who once boasted of Diddy's genius. Some sat in stunned silence. Others looked physically ill. A woman in the back row, wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf, wept quietly. A man 2 rows ahead whispered to no one in particular, "I thought it was just some weird Hollywood spa thing." A bailiff shot him a warning glance. No one in the room wanted to admit what they were all thinking. They had heard rumors for years. Whispers. Strange party stories. But Ryan Reynolds had spoken the unspeakable, and suddenly it didn't seem so far-fetched. Now, every Hollywood party from the past decade was under retroactive suspicion. The trial had become more than a legal reckoning. It was a cultural purge, a spectacle with no breaks. After the explosive cross-examination and Diddy's courtroom outburst, U.S. Attorney Damian Williams returned to the floor with quiet confidence, walking deliberately toward the witness stand. The room hushed again, jurors visibly leaning forward as Williams adjusted his cuffs and fixed Ryan Reynolds with a steady gaze. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, voice calm but cutting, "were you ever physically harmed during these alleged rituals?" Reynolds didn't hesitate. "No," he said, "but I was emotionally dismantled." A few jurors glanced up at that. Williams nodded slightly and continued, "By Mr. Combs?" Reynolds took a breath. "By the entire system he built around himself. The rituals, the manipulation. It wasn't just him whispering in your ear. It was the atmosphere, the people, the silence. It was a fortress, and he was its architect." A murmur moved through the gallery. From the defense table, Tenny Garagos scribbled notes furiously while Mark Agnifilo leaned toward Diddy, who now sat completely still, stoic, impassive, lips slightly pursed. Williams turned to the jury with purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing toward Reynolds, "what you've just heard wasn't a story about eccentric celebrity behavior. This wasn't therapy. This wasn't even a cult. This was psychological imprisonment, crafted by power, sustained by fear, and enforced by fame." He paused, letting his words settle like ash, and Mr. Reynolds escaped to tell the truth. The moment was surgical, clean, devastating, and final. The jurors looked shaken, some nodding unconsciously. In that brief silence, something shifted. The courtroom, once a battleground of narratives, had begun to tilt. This wasn't just a case about a music mogul and a beloved actor anymore. It was about what happens when charisma curdles into control, and one man finds the courage to break free from the illusion. After days of blistering testimony and a mounting pile of public outrage, it was Mark Agnofilo's turn to reclaim the courtroom. Calm, polished, and precise, Diddy's lead defense attorney rose from his seat, buttoned his tailored navy suit, and approached the bench like a man threading a needle through flames. "Your Honor," he began, addressing Judge Arun Subramanian, "my client wishes to make it very clear. These were consensual experiences. Artistic rituals, symbolic acts among adults, exploring the outer boundaries of self-awareness and transcendence." He turned to the jury with practiced solemnity. "We are not here to put eccentricity on trial. We are here to assess whether anything criminal occurred. And despite the compelling performance we just witnessed," he gestured lightly toward Reynolds, "there is no evidence of coercion, no contracts, no threats, no crime." A few jurors stirred, unsure whether to be persuaded or repulsed. From the prosecution's table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maureen Comey stood sharply, fury radiating off her in waves. "Is submerging a man in boiling tomato soup while whispering threats into his ear your idea of transcendence, Mr. Agnifilo?" she snapped. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Agnifilo blinked. The courtroom froze. Even Judge Subramanian leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed. No one moved. No one breathed. For a brief second, the weight of absurdity, horror, and truth collapsed into a single moment of reckoning. Diddy stared straight ahead, unmoving, his poker face now a mask of exhaustion. "Objection," Agnifilo finally muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Judge Subramanian didn't respond immediately. The courtroom was no longer just listening. They were watching, calculating, choosing what they believed, and the silence said everything. As the late afternoon sun filtered through the high windows of courtroom 26B, the day's proceedings drew to a somber close. Ryan Reynolds rose slowly from the witness stand, every step weighted with the burden of his revelations. The gallery held its breath, the air thick with unspoken tension. The silence was palpable, no applause, no murmurs, just the heavy stillness of a truth hanging in the balance. Sean "Diddy" Combs remained seated at the defense table, his posture rigid, his eyes deliberately fixed on a distant point. He did not glance once in Reynolds' direction. The two men, once linked by fame and friendship, now stood worlds apart in a courtroom that had become a battleground of shattered trust. Judge Arun Subramanian cleared his throat and addressed the packed courtroom with measured gravity. "This case is no longer just about celebrity. It is about power, control, and the line between influence and abuse." His words echoed through the chamber, a stark reminder that beyond the glitz and glamour lay deeper questions about the nature of manipulation, the fragility of freedom, and the cost of silence. Outside, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters clamored to capture every detail, microphones jostling for position, cameras flashing relentlessly. Fans and onlookers gathered in waves, some weeping quietly, others chanting slogans born from social media's explosive frenzy. The hashtags #TomatoSoupGate and #FreeReynolds trended worldwide, turning the trial into a cultural flashpoint. The verdict was not yet near. Weeks of deliberations and legal wrangling remained. But one thing was clear. In Courtroom 26B, Hollywood's carefully curated facade had been irrevocably torn apart, exposed, raw, and unsettling. One tomato-slicked secret at a time. The world was watching, and nothing would ever be the same.